welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. It is practically August, just slightly, a couple more days before it is, and I cannot actually believe that we are already at this point in the summer. And basically what that means is that students who haven't been working on their applications definitely need to start. One of the things we're going to be talking about today are supplemental essays. So that is looming in the future. As soon as the Common App goes live on August 1, most colleges are going to have their supplemental essay prompts available. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those today. We're also going to be talking about 3+2 engineering programs. So if you or your student is thinking that maybe they want engineering, but they want to explore some other things first, a 3+2 program could be the perfect choice, and we're going to tell you more about that. But first, we're going to talk a little bit more about what it means when a college meets 100% of demonstrated need. And joining me for that conversation is my colleague, Jean Mahan, who is a former financial aid officer at both Tufts and Quinsigamond Community College. Hi, Jean. How are you?
Hi, Beth. I'm great. How are you today?
Good. And I feel like it's been a while since you and I were on the podcast together.
Yeah, I think so.
Happy to have you here. One of the things that comes up, I don't know for how frequently, but it definitely comes up regularly, is this concept of colleges who pledge to meet 100% of demonstrated need. And, school, first of all, we get a lot of skepticism about that. Well, how is that possible? How could they meet every student's need? And then there's also this college says they meet 100% of need. Why didn't I get any financial aid, right?
Yeah.
So they've pledged to do this. So what does it actually mean when a college says that they are going to meet 100% of demonstrated need?
Right. So families fill out financial aid applications. Everyone fills out a FAFSA. And then there are another couple hundred schools that use the College Scholarship Service CSS profile that the College Board puts out. And so, of course, everybody thinks they can't afford to send their kids to college. Like, I've never really met a person that thinks their EFC is reasonable or doable. Right. So, we're all in that same boat. But the school uses that information that families provide on their income and their non-retirement assets to determine what that family can pay. So you may not think that you can afford $30,000 a year, but based on the information you provided, that's what the school is telling you. So often families will say to me, well, I attended a session and they said finances will not be a problem. That should not be a barrier to enrollment. And it's a barrier enrollment for me. And that's the reason is because they're looking at the numbers and they're saying, based on what you've told us, this is what we think you can provide.
Right.
So it's usually not the number that the family had in mind.
Right. Exactly. The big issue, right, is that the family thinks they have this amount of need. The college says you actually have this amount of need, and there's a difference between the two.
Yes, for sure.
So I guess that's the question is, how is a family's need calculated? Why are there differences between the two?
Right. So at schools that only use a FAFSA, they're not looking at things like your home equity. So, if you're applying to a school that uses a profile, most of those schools are going to use a percentage of your home equity in calculating your family contribution. Every school is looking at things like your adjusted gross income for 2 years prior to the year of enrollment. They're looking at non-retirement assets. So if you have a vacation home, they're looking at equity in that vacation home. If you have a rental property, they're looking at your rental income. If you won the lottery last year, they're looking at those winnings, right?
Right.
So, and maybe you've got untaxed income. Maybe you withdrew from a retirement account. Maybe you had an inheritance. And so all of those things are factoring into what the school is looking at to determine what you can pay. As I mentioned, there's a few hundred schools that use the CSS profile, and the majority of those are also going to be using home equity at different percentages. So the best way to kind of get a sense of what you might be eligible for is to go onto the school's website and use a net price calculator. If the school requires information about your home equity, they'll ask that on the net price calculator, so you'll see different results than you may at a similarly priced school that doesn't use the CSS profile.
Right.
So that's pretty much, it's a pretty simple formula. Now, maybe last year you won the lottery and you spent that on paying down your mortgage, paying down debt, whatever. Go back to the school and say, hey, yeah, that's in my income for the base year, but it's no longer a thing. or I
Right.
lost my job, or during COVID, I was laid off for 6 months. So those are things that families can go back to a school and say, yes, this is what it looked like in the base year, but that's no longer the case. So I think a lot of families don't realize you can go back and tell them, yeah, that was a snapshot in time, but today is a new day.
Right.
And so you want them to sort of know kind of what today looks like. Another thing that I hear from families a lot is they may be supporting other relatives, parents, parents of the parents,
Yes.
uh, grown children, whatever. And that's not necessarily showing up on these financial aid applications. But I once spoke to a family who was spending $75,000 a year in elder care for the students' grandparents. That's huge. That took
Yeah.
a huge chunk out of their available income. So I encourage them to go back to the school and tell them about that so the school can make an adjustment. And most of the time, they're willing to do that for extenuating circumstances, medical, natural disasters, job losses, death of a parent, something like that. So
Right.
never hesitate to go back and make your unusual circumstances known to them.
Right. I mean, I think this underscores one really important thing that we talk about all the time, which is it's never a bad thing to ask. The
Mm-hmm.
worst that can happen is the school will say
They say
no.
no.
They're never going to yank what they've already offered
Right, right,
or the offer of admission, right? So, and
exactly.
I also think it does all point to the fact that different schools might view it differently, and one school might say absolutely, we completely recognize it, and another school may recognize a little bit of it but not all of it. So it is a bit on a case by case basis, and you do need to ask, and you probably want to ask at every
Mm-hmm.
school that your child is interested
Right.
in, and try and negotiate. So getting back to this question of how can colleges commit to, so we've already identified, right, that there is a difference, there
Mm-hmm.
can be a difference between what you think your need is and what the college thinks the need is.
Right.
So but if we put that to the side, how can a college commit to that if they have no idea who's going to be in their applicant pool? What allows them to say confidently, we will meet 100% of demonstrated need or
Mm-hmm.
unmet need?
That's a great question because I think some families are very skeptical of the fact that
Yes.
schools can do this. But when you think about some of the top universities in the country, you think about Stanford, Harvard, MIT, they have enormous endowments,
Mhm.
enormous. And so they can devote more of their endowment towards assisting families that do have need.
Right.
So they're not putting you on, they're not punking you, they're really doing it. And so there are only, though, and this is important for families to understand, only about 78 colleges in the country that meet 100% of families' demonstrated need. How do you find out that information?
Yes.
Well, you can check the website of a school because certainly they're going to be very proud to say, we meet 100% of demonstrated need. Or if you're looking for a quicker way to do that, you can go to our blog. And we have a post from July of last year, colleges that have the most generous financial aid. Just search
Mhm.
for that, it will pop up and it will give you a list of all the schools in the country. So that's a much easier and faster way. So if your student has 5 or 6 schools of the on the list and
Mhm.
they're on that list, great. You know
Right.
that, you can be pretty sure that they're going to be, helping you.
Right. I think the other point that I would make too about the colleges that promise to do this is that not only do they have generally pretty filled coffers to fund
Mhm.
stuff like that, but they also see over time, I mean, those kinds of schools attract students and applicants who are wealthy. And so they are not necessarily going to have 100% of students in the applicant pool who will qualify for
Mhm.
financial aid, right? So there's going to be a hefty percentage that that are going to be full pay, that don't need financial aid. What
Right.
it really does mean, though, and as someone who did admissions at one of these schools that meets 100% of demonstrated need, that applying for financial aid, needing it or not needing it, was never a conversation in
Mhm.
the admissions committee. So we never discussed whether a family could afford Penn or not afford Penn. It
Mhm.
was a non-factor in our admissions. And that's
Mhm.
because we had the beauty of a backing of a policy that was, we will meet 100% of demonstrated need. On the flip side too, and I'm sure this is not the case for all of those schools, I think, what did you say, 76 or 78?
78 about. Mhm.
78, right? Not all of those. Some of those schools probably do merit aid, but the more generous schools and the more selective schools, what you will tend to find is that they are only giving financial aid and not merit, right? So you
Yes.
only will get money if you need it, you're
Right.
not going to get money just because they want you to come.
Yeah, you're wonderful. The pool is full of wonderful Einstein
Yes.
types. And so it's very hard for them to differentiate. So they're much more generous. So at one school that doesn't meet 100% of unmet need, you may not qualify for need-based aid, even with your income, say in the low 200,000 range. But
Right.
at some of these schools where the cost is now about $80,000, you may qualify for something. It may not be half of tuition. It may only be 5 or 10,000, but isn't it better to get 5 or 10,000 that somebody else is paying
Right.
than you having to come out of your pocket?
Right.
So I encourage families to look at that blog so they can see that list all in one place, and also to do the net price calculators just to get a sense of what am I eligible for at
Right.
this particular school. And if you have some unusual circumstances, it's hard to do a net price calculator if you're a divorced family, because it doesn't really work that way.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you think you might be on the cusp, it's probably worth having a conversation with the financial aid office at the school to find out, especially if your student is considering applying early decision, which is
Yeah.
binding, to have a conversation to say, this is what it looks like. Tell us whether we're in the ballpark or not.
Right.
And that way you can go into an ED with eyes wide open.
Yeah, and I think that's another highlighting again, it never hurts to ask. There is no harm in asking before your student applies. Again, financial aid is not going to be ringing up admissions and saying, don't admit this student, they have a ton of need, right? Does not work that way. So if you have questions, ask them beforehand, because the other challenge, ED is binding, and yes, you can be released from the commitment if the financial aid package is not one that you feel you can handle as a family. But if presumably the student's applying early decision, they get in, they're super excited. Now you have a situation where you don't have enough financial aid. You have to tell your student, sorry, I know you got into your dream school, but we can't afford it. And that is also a difficult conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I would say for a lot of families, that's the hardest conversation, right? So why not have it in advance? And that way, when you're, you don't commit to an early decision school, and then find out later that there's no way the package is going to meet what you think you need, you'll find that out in advance, and your student can focus on maybe a different early decision school, or not do early decision.
Right, 100% agree.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just really important to do the due diligence prior to, and having a conversation with your students so that you're all on the same page.
Yeah. And I'm going to put in plug again, and I am going through this as a parent, so I can say that I am following my own advice. The conversation about money cannot wait until after the fact.
Oh, no.
Or just like not happen, right? So
Right.
on a previous podcast recently, we talked about how to have the talk. Either that or we're going to be airing one. It's coming soon, if it hasn't aired already. And that has actually been part of the conversation that I'm having with my son. And it's been part of the conversation since the very beginning. So we are not putting schools on the list where he won't either qualify for financial aid or for some merit aid. And we're not going to really qualify for financial aid, I don't think. So we're really focused mostly on the schools that are either starting at a price point we can afford, or where he's going to qualify for merit aid that might make it affordable. But if he doesn't, then that school will be out even if he gets in. So difficult, but important. Right.
And I encourage families. So if our listeners have 9th or 10th graders, have that conversation now. So your kids will roll their eyes because that's what teenagers do.
Yeah.
That's their job. But your job is to remind them about, this is a family kind of thing. We're going to help. You're going to help. Hopefully you'll get some aid from the school or some merit scholarships, but this is what we can do. And these are the things that we can't do. Maybe you're not in a position to borrow. Maybe you don't want to.
Yeah.
And that's okay too. But, have that conversation so that, like you said, on April 28th of your child's senior year, you're not all of a sudden saying, whoops, we really can't afford this school that we got nothing from.
Right.
So early and often, as they say.
I think so. Like voting, right? Early and often. Jean, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was great to be here. Have a great day.
Thank you. All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we're going to be talking more about those 3+2 engineering programs that I mentioned earlier. So don't go away.